Hello, everybody, and welcome back to English 2367. This is K-Swizzle checking in with your Week 6 focused lecture, which is titled Writing and Researching for a Literature Review, Locating, Synthesizing, and Citing Secondary Sources. And as you can probably tell after having watched the overview lecture and or reviewing the slides for the overview lecture, we are focusing entirely on secondary research for this week and thinking about how secondary research can really be an important tool in developing a research project, and more specifically in thinking about what role do secondary sources play when developing an argument-driven analysis. So on our agenda, we've got 5 sections that we're going to cover. This is a lengthy lecture, as all of my focused lectures are, but I do think that it is useful to just flag that for you and really encourage you to take breaks in between sections of this lecture. I generally recommend breaking, the watch time for a lecture into, increments of 20 or 30 minutes, just because it's good to give your brain a break. But also, if you're a person who makes a to-do list, it can be helpful to feel like you're checking more than one thing off your list by breaking the lecture into multiple parts, okay? And so really for this focus lecture, I'm going to be doing a combination of things, one of which is I'm going to be offering some general, just kind of guidance and information on what it means to write the close reading section of an essay, especially in thinking back to our discussion last week. I'm really encouraging you to think beyond the steps of the 5-paragraph essay that you may have written in high school, and instead start thinking about your essay in sections of an introductory section, a close reading section, and a concluding section, because that's what's going to really allow for you to think about what kinds of choices do you need to make in terms of number of paragraphs, structure of those paragraphs, and other details that we'll cover more substantially throughout the course of this lecture. But in terms of the agenda breakdown, we're going to start with recapping rhetoric and specifically reviewing so what and who says, because I didn't have time to cover what the chapter from last week really got into. And so I find that for this lecture, it's helpful to pair that together with what is being covered in this week's secondary reading. Then we'll talk about the acronym Writing is a Treat, and specifically we'll use this to talk about baking close reading pie filling in your final project. And we'll be using the pie analogy throughout this lecture and really until the end of the semester to help guide our way of thinking about writing as a process, and that the process for us is one in which we are preparing and baking a treat, and that treat is pie. From there, we'll talk about baking a literature review and specifically what you will need to complete your literature review assignment. There are 4 steps to my coverage of this literature review, the first of which is pre-work research based on Who Says Chapter 5, namely because I wanted to make sure that I could cover some aspects of the textbook that we don't have the time to talk about in the course of the semester because this is an accelerated course. And so I wanted to cover some things that you would not have seen yet. I'm going to talk as well about the DISCA method of structuring your literature review. Folks who have had me as an instructor before know that I really rely on this method of DISCA that I've come up with for working on an annotated bibliography and a literature review. And so I'll talk about the significance of each of those letters, and we'll pair that, of course, with a recipe card that guides you through how to create your literature review. From there, we'll talk about how to synthesize a source and really the ways that you can try to strategize avoiding plagiarism. One of the common issues that students face in 1110 and 2367 is accidental plagiarism by taking the words from the creator that you're citing and using them too identical to what the writer originally put. And so we're going to talk about how do you avoid that when you're summarizing as opposed to quoting. Then we'll talk briefly about what's in a text, the works cited page, since you will need one for your literature review. And then finally, I've provided some sample literature reviews to help give you some examples for this assignment, as well as sample final projects to help you look ahead to week 7 and 8 if you're interested in seeing just some ways that students in the past who've taken this class with me have navigated the process of developing a final project, particularly when they did a creative option instead of a traditional research paper. So let's begin with recapping rhetoric and specifically reviewing what was covered in the So What chapter and the Who Says chapter that were assigned for last week and this week, respectively. So one of the kind of major points that is conveyed to us through the readings is this idea that we want to design our arguments deliberately by putting everything in its place for a reason. And this might seem relatively obvious, but I wanted to really emphasize and start here because when it comes to creating an argument, it can be really easy to forget that we want to be very thoughtful and intentional about what we do when we're putting together an argument, right? It's kind of like other forms like painting, or even I think about this too, with like when you're organizing something in, let's say, your house or your room, right? That by really being intentional about what steps that you're taking, you can accomplish a number of things like, using your time most effectively. It can also be a matter of just like knowing what you're going to do and reducing some of your stress, right? But more specifically, by thinking about an argument as a process in which we're really thoughtfully deciding where things go and putting them there for a reason, it also helps us just to be aware of the fact that the reader is really relying on us to guide them through this process of understanding the argument that we're producing and helping them to feel comfortable, to be compelled by that argument so much that they're willing to accept it as persuasive, right? And so when we think about the ways that we're supporting the reader who is engaging with our argument, the books kind of offer these two suggestions, or these two ideas about how we can reduce reader workload. The first of which is move from known to unknown information, general to specific ideas, and accepted to controversial arguments. And they follow this with create smooth connections and fill in any gaps that might interrupt the flow. And following these guidelines will not only help to organize your writing, but also to help your readers digest your ideas more easily, okay? And so what I want to just kind of offer here as a starting point is that when it comes to creating an argument, it can be helpful to think about what kind of a point of entry are you creating for your reader in the course of offering and developing your introductory section? And how are you setting them up for success by ensuring that they have all of the information that they need in that intro to feel confident that they can move through reading your paper and follow along with your reasoning and your logic, okay? And this also connects then with the smooth connections, right? Making sure that we're not overlooking or making assumptions about what our reader already knows. We're really keeping that kind of no assumptions made, or the N in writing, very close in mind as we work. The authors, I should say, also offer some additional ideas of thinking about just kind of as you're getting started with your project, right? What should you keep in mind? And there are a few things that we can think about here. The first of which is, what's my purpose? Then what genre and style choices will help me achieve my purpose? What role am I playing? What's my audience's stance towards this issue? How do writers typically organize this genre of argument? And should I conduct original research, such as collecting data or performing experiments? So I include this to say that if you'll recall, when we talked about the rhetorical situation in the earlier lectures for this class, I really emphasized the connectivity between audience, project, author, context, right? And kind of the argument really relying on that kind of closeness between all of those parts. As a social media studies scholar, I also think about this as being quite similar to what we see on platforms like YouTube or TikTok or Instagram, right? And that we've talked about this semester. This idea that for the message to be effectively delivered, there has to be a kind of connection between, a relationship between the one being viewed and the one doing the viewing. A lot of people talk about this as a parasocial relationship, or the idea that, the audience has to feel a type of investment or closeness with, or ability to identify with who they're watching to really want to come back and continue to watch them. Somewhat similarly, when we're creating an argument, you can think about some similar aspects here, right? That you're also developing a persona in your own writing. And you want to really think about, what persona is conducive to you speaking to your reader through the course of your argument. Additionally, you also want to consider, when it comes to your purpose, right? What are you trying to achieve or accomplish in the course of putting this project together? And this is going to be something that's incredibly important when moving into your final project, because you want to have a really clear sense of what is it that you ultimately are trying to accomplish. Of course, in a sort of more obvious sense, we know that you want to achieve a good or passing grade in this class. But beyond that, in envisioning how you're developing this argument, you want to think about things like, is there a call to action? Is there a societal issue that I see this project that I'm developing addressing in some way, et cetera, okay? And we'll continue to talk about these things as we move into the final, but I really would encourage you to keep these kinds of questions that the authors offer fresh in your mind, because you do want to consider, how is your position as the author of your project ultimately facilitating a potential connection with your reader? And especially that's going to be more obvious and more on display when we get to the rough draft of your final project, which is when, of course, your semester survival group members will once again be reviewing your work. The books also offer the scholarly model as a way of thinking about how we can generally see argumentation being structured in an academic context. And I really like the way that they lay out, I should say, the scholarly model, because I think it does a pretty good job of breaking it down into smaller parts and knowing that we have an introduction, background, support, consideration of alternative arguments, and a conclusion. Depending on the needs of your project, you may find that the counter argument isn't going to be as crucial as some of these other elements. And so on the left side of the screen, I offer some kind of, bubbles that expand on or kind of, for our purposes, identify the parts of the scholarly model that are of most interest to us, right? So when they talk about the introduction, for our purposes, we can understand this to be the introductory section where we offer that point of entry, that topic overview, and that elaboration of argument that we discussed last week, right? So thinking about your thesis pie crust, thinking about the way that you're forming that pie crust out of the ingredients that you gather, the ingredients that you pour and mix together in a bowl. You then, form it into a dough made of that context. That dough then, of course, is rolled out into the elaboration of argument and ultimately formed into your thesis pie crust. That we can understand to be the introductory section, that the introduction listed here in this scholarly model is really covering the same types of, techniques and information. But of course, for our purposes, the background that they mention here, we can think of as our socio-political context, or the context that also is really informing the introductory section that we're developing. Now, for this week with our literature review, we're really achieving the background section of this scholarly model. And we can think about the literature review as being the background, namely because, as we'll see as we move from the standalone literature review to the final project, a literature review is really an opportunity for you to engage with the literature on the topic that you are analyzing and discussing, okay? And so, as I'll kind of expand on in later slides, you're really entering into a conversation and participating in that conversation by synthesizing and observing what's already been said in that conversation by way of the literature review. And so with the background, we can really think about this then as meaning when we're developing a thesis-driven argument, we need to move from having an introductory section where you are really establishing what the aims are of your project to having a literature review of some kind that falls within that close reading section where you have the opportunity to develop a kind of substantial bridge between the intro and the close readings that you perform. Now, the close readings, or the support, as you'll see in this scholarly model, is really going to be where you work with one or more primary sources of some kind, and you proceed to analyze in some meaningful way something about that primary source that exemplifies what it is that you're arguing in your project, okay? And the purpose of having close readings of primary sources is you can really think about it as sort of observing concepts in action. So for example, in thinking about a primary source like an episode of Ear Hustle, like the Sellies episode that we listened to, let's say, we can understand that one of the ways that the Sellies episode of Ear Hustle could function as a primary source that you do close readings of might be, let's decide in your, or let's, assume or say in your introductory section that you've decided that you want to talk about the use of personal narrative in Ear Hustle and how the use of personal narrative accomplishes something that's quite different than something else you see in mainstream media, right? The purpose of having the support section or the close readings of primary sources in the body of your paper is it's giving you an opportunity to actually show us the concept of a personal narrative in action, right? You're pointing us to specific moments within the text when it's actually doing the things that you're arguing are significant in the intro, okay? Like I said, counter argument is the fourth section of the scholarly model. Depending on the needs of your paper, you may or may not have it. I generally find that this is a bit more conducive to a paper that's talking about sort of, recapping a scholarly debate on a topic. Like, for instance, in classes where maybe you have to talk about the historical conflicts or waves over issues related to politics, you might see counter argument being something that you really need to cover more substantially. For our purposes, it is optional, but I think it's still good to be aware of it in the traditional scholarly model. And then finally, concluding takeaways, or for our purposes, the concluding section, where you're really kind of rounding back to the intro section by showing how there are points of connectivity between where you started, where you end up, and having some takeaways that ideally your reader will remember. Some other details from So What that I think are also good to highlight, and I strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to go back and read once more, are the sections where they offer techniques for organizing paragraphs on page 167 and techniques for developing and expanding arguments on page 171. Why should you go back to these? Well, I think that these particular, excerpts from So What are some of the most useful that you can really work with going into the final. Reason being, they offer some really good writing strategy tips that are helpful to keep in your back pocket when it comes to thinking about how do you actually organize and how do you actually build out a more robust argument beyond the research proposal stage that we've been at currently, right? And so, for instance, when they're talking about organizing paragraphs, they tell us move from general to specific, known to unknown in your paper, highlight agreement before disagreement to build common ground with your reader, repeat key terms to highlight connections and create a sense of unity, stick to the point and avoid filling your paper with irrelevant information, and create a reverse outline of paragraphs that you've already written. Now, the reason I really like these techniques is because they offer some really great advice for thinking about what should you get down on paper and what sequence should they occur in when it comes to constructing your paragraphs, right? So, and they cover this more substantially in these pages that I encourage you to revisit. But I will say, particularly their point about repeating key terms is something to keep in mind, and you'll kind of see input from me in terms of your research proposal draft that you want to really think about. Are there some terms that you can use, repetitively throughout your essay that will help the reader understand what you're pointing them towards, whether that's personal narrative or erasure or representation, right? Very similarly to how we've seen authors of scholarly sources and popular press articles utilize key terms that we then talk about as key concepts in our class, you want to also think about, are there key concepts that you can offer in the course of your paper? It's really going to allow you to ground the topic and argument in some way. When it comes to developing and expanding your arguments, they also offer a few other things to consider, such as conducting more research, digging deeper into your analysis, defining terms, providing more examples, building transitions by offering signposting for the reader, adding meta commentary, and aiming for reader-centered writing by offering support and rationales. I'm not going to cover this too deeply because I have plenty of other just things to talk about today in terms of writing strategies, and I want to be mindful of time. But I would ask that you revisit this section because these are incredibly important techniques that you will see me provide marginal comments on your papers in instances where these types of elements are missing, right? So for example, under-researched points that you make that maybe are leaning too much into generalization as opposed to having, some kind of citation that shows where you're, basing your argumentative claim off of, defining terms and not making assumptions that the reader already know what they mean or what significance they have to the text, right? And especially building transitions is one you're going to see me flag quite often in your writing, of making sure that each sentence really moves seamlessly into the next and is not confusing or jarring to the reader. They also offer this really interesting section about finding sources. And I really like these 3 suggestions that they offer here of documenting everything, collecting now, sorting later, and don't limit yourself. And the reason that I like these 3 is because they offer some really good just insight into thinking about the process of researching and how for an assignment like a literature review, of course, you're having to actually gather materials first before you can start the process of writing your literature review. But when it comes to thinking about the actual tangible steps that you have to take, remembering to document everything that you come across in case you want to go back and find something or use it unexpectedly is a really good tip, because there's been plenty of times that I didn't write something down and then I regret it later and waste time having to go back and retrace my steps. The point about collecting now and sorting later is also really helpful from the perspective that you can kind of think about the fact that gathering up all of your materials and then later on deciding how you're going to organize them together is also kind of in the spirit of the literature review, in that you're gathering together things that feel relevant to your topic. And then instead of having to kind of start and stop continuously, you're able to actually do that secondary process after the fact and not have to waste time, researching, pausing to do sort of more in-depth work, and then having to restart again. You're really sustaining the momentum in this scenario. And then finally, don't limit yourself, right? So when it comes to a research process, you don't want to accidentally go in with the mindset of, I know exactly what I need and I'm not open to finding anything else. It's similar to if you go to a bookstore or even just a store in general, right? If you're going clothes shopping, let's say, you don't always necessarily want to just limit yourself to only looking for one particular type of item. It's very possible that by kind of opening yourself up and allowing yourself to browse, you might come across something that's actually a better fit than what you initially assumed. The authors also offer a really useful set of terms called primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. Now, primary and secondary should look familiar to us given that we have talked about them briefly before, but I think that they are useful to just kind of recap, especially going into the literature review assignment. So in terms of the primary source, this is going to be an original material. They're often firsthand accounts written or recorded by an eyewitness and may also contain raw data. Primary sources are pure without interpretation, and they have not been changed, right? So it could be photographs, patents, speeches, audio recordings of events, interviews, diaries, physical artifacts, letters, and legal documents, among many other things. As I mentioned earlier in the semester, we of course have used primary sources like YouTube videos and TikToks and podcast episodes. And the idea is that using them as a primary source means that we're using them as our kind of first and foremost source of talking about a concept or an argument in action, right? And beyond that, the point of having a primary source is that you're really analyzing it in such a way that it allows you to kind of look into your topic and argument much deeper than if you just talked about it more generally. All right, secondary sources, as they mentioned, are more difficult to define. They're often created with the use of primary sources, and they may be the result of someone having evaluated and interpreted raw data. And this is going to be a place where we can really think about if a primary source may be considered evidence, a secondary source is the result of reviewing and discussing that evidence. And some examples of secondary sources include biographies, scholarly writing, reviews and critiques, dictionaries, and most magazine and newspaper articles. Now, I really like this definition of secondary sources for a few reasons, one of which is I like the way that they kind of clarify that we can imagine a primary source as being evidence, right? So if we know that you have to produce an argument, we can think then of the primary source as being the sort of best evidence or sort of most useful example of what it is that we're talking about. Whereas the secondary sources are really going to be additional lenses that we're using to analyze that primary source, right? So for instance, let's say that you decided to do your final project based off of, I don't know, one of the TikToks that we watched, right? Let's say you decided to use Shina Nova's TikTok about missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit folks, okay? In deciding to work with that MMIW TikTok and knowing that's going to be your primary source, that would mean that you would need to determine what types of techniques or self-mediation strategies or kind of key concepts are really exemplified by that TikTok that then relate to the larger argument that you're trying to make. And then from there, you can think about, okay, I'll need secondary sources that are going to really supplement my analysis of this TikTok and what it's doing for the MMIW G2S movement. And so that might mean, okay, I need a scholarly source that explains what MMIW G2S is. Perhaps you need a popular press article that talks about shadow banning and how it affects the movement, right? And so the idea then is that the secondary sources are really allowing you to back up what it is that you're analyzing in that primary source. Then tertiary sources present a list or collection of primary and secondary sources. These sources are often seen as a guide to primary and secondary sources, as tertiary sources are presented as an overview. And then it makes the point of keep in mind that most instructors and those who adhere to their subject area conventions will frown on tertiary sources as part of your bibliography, unless of course you're doing a study of, say, Wikipedia itself. Some examples of tertiary sources include manuals, indexes, databases, bibliographies, most textbooks, and encyclopedias. So a tertiary source is going to be something that already kind of does the synthesis work for you. And its function is really to explain what it is that the intervention made by the secondary source is, and helps to give you kind of a general overview or understanding of the topic or matter at hand. And so that's where a tertiary source isn't going to be as helpful for our purposes, right? Because instead of really offering an argumentative intervention that can supplement the intervention you yourself are making about the primary source in your final project, a tertiary source is really going to be more so a supplemental guide that could help you to understand something that's perhaps unclear in one of your secondary sources. Now, I offer a helpful tip at the bottom that every final project should offer close readings of primary sources of some kind. You will want to review your research proposal and consider if the sources you have proposed using in your project are scholarly or popular discourse texts that may be better suited as part of the literature review rather than as a primary source. I say this because sometimes in the research proposal, a student will say something to the effect of, I really enjoyed Sophia Umoja Noble's article that we read, and I'd like to analyze that as my primary source for the final project. Now, there's nothing wrong with using Noble's source in your project, but it would be better suited as a secondary source than a primary source. Reason being, Noble's article, for example, works well as a secondary source if you decided that your final project focused on something like, what harms are enacted by social media when images of Black folks are circulated online without their consent, particularly in situations when they are being harmed or murdered by the police, right? We would know then that Noble's article would be a great secondary source for that topic because she really focuses in on presenting an argument with data and evidence that really back up her claims about why social media can function as a post-traumatic technology of terror, right? It would not work as well as a primary source because for your primary source, you ideally would want to use something that can act as the kind of evidence or example of your point. So perhaps you decided to work with an episode of a TV show where a character, their narrative develops around this topic and they're really anxious about something. Perhaps you decide to use an infographic series on that was created on Canva but is posted to Instagram. Maybe it's a TikTok of someone talking about, even some of the recent shootings that occurred, right? And so the idea here is that your primary source would need to be something that really exemplifies or showcases the point that you're making in your argument, as opposed to the secondary sources should really support or kind of complicate the argument that you're making by providing a kind of wider understanding of it. Now, I mentioned here that in your final project, the function of secondary sources is to contextualize, support, complicate, or vet your argumentative claims featured in each paragraph. The function of primary sources is to show concepts in action, which you've heard me say, which is a way of thinking about, providing your reader with a text that exemplifies a trend or issue you're observing and commenting on in your thesis, or that shows an instance when a creator is performing a self-mediation or self-representation strategy in their work that you would like to assess. And so the idea is that you bring in secondary sources into your final project as a way of really backing up or kind of making more nuanced your analysis and discussion of the topic. And so to offer a primary source as opposed to a secondary source, you may need to compile your own data, find examples from the creator or creators that you're studying, highlight key examples from the platform or platforms being studied, produce your own texts, narrate and present your own study, etc. Right? So the idea here is that if we think back to something like the Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on TV article, they conducted a study that allowed them to then have the data results that they proceeded to analyze in that article, right? That's one way that someone would create the data that would allow them to actually do their, project because they're creating the primary source. For our purposes, you can really think about, are there social media texts? Are there mainstream media texts? Are there other texts of some kind that you could work with as your basis or your foundation for your final project to give you that opportunity to really talk about, the argument or the point that you're making in the thesis and show it in action. So I'm going to move to writing as a treat momentarily, but I'm going to pause so that I can cough just because I'm, still getting used to talking for extended periods of time. And then I will be back to start this section. All right, let's talk about writing as a treat or baking close reading pie filling in your final project. And you'll notice in this lecture that I'm really weaving together the literature review and the final project on purpose because they are, of course, connected through the semester research project, which is 3 steps. But also because I really want to establish why we're doing the literature review in the first place to really understand what we're building towards so we can see the usefulness of this literature review. Additionally, I find that in talking about the process of writing a close reading section, it makes a lot of sense to relate that to the final project a bit more than the literature review, just because I am trying to cover general writing studies approaches to thinking about the close reading section of an essay and not limiting my discussion today to the literature review. And so you'll kind of see by the time you start working on the final project how that makes sense. And so for now, we can really think about that we're starting broad in that we're starting with, of course, recapping rhetoric to know what we've talked about in the last 2 weeks in regards to writing strategies with the textbooks. And now we've been moving closer into thinking about writing the body of a paper to really prepare us for understanding why we even are worrying about producing a literature review that will ultimately help to comprise that body section of your final project. So as I mentioned, we really want to think about writing as baking, and we can envision this pumpkin pie as being this kind of key example or key image for us to keep in mind, with the pie crust being the thesis, the full pie being the argument, the pie slice being the paragraph and claim made in the topic sentence, the pie filling being the evidence close reading or your primary source close readings, the pie decoration being the evidence secondary connection or every time that you make an in-text reference to a secondary source, and the pie tin or pie plate is being the conclusion that all of this is placed upon. We've talked already about the preliminary steps that we must do before writing, which I think of as writing steps. And we talked about these first with the highlight reels, and they continue to be relevant to us given that they are these kind of pre-work stages that we really need to have done before we can even be in a position to write. And once again, those are watch and read everything that is assigned, reflect on material you engaged with, identify content and form elements in your primary source. Once again, content being the message, form being the how it's communicated. Take time to outline your ideas for the paper, incorporate organizational tools into your process, no assumptions made about what your audience knows, and get creative with how you convey your ideas. Last week, we also talked about expanding the acronym from writing to writing is a, and we learned that is stands for indicate context and scope and state your thesis, and A stands for analysis, not opinion. And of course, I introduced the kind of additional point that is can also stand for introductory section, because we want to remember that indicating context and scope and stating your thesis should happen in the introductory section of your paper. And analysis, not opinion, is just a general reminder that what we're striving to do here is create a thesis-driven analysis, not merely offer our opinion on the topic. Now from here, we can expand to writing is a treat. And the reason I set it up this way is I like to kind of think about what does it actually mean to construct a paragraph, okay? And so I have divided this acronym of treat up into smaller parts that all just really represent the sequence of a paragraph in a thesis-driven analysis, okay? T stands for topic sentence that makes a claim. R stands for review the critical detail or scene. E stands for examine closely the communication strategy. A stands for assess effectiveness strategy, and T stands for transition to next topic. And the treat formula is really going to be most beneficial to use in situations when you are performing a close reading of your primary source. So in the body of your essay, you'll have paragraphs or sections, however your final project is structured, but you'll have areas where you'll really want to perform those primary source close readings, right? And so treat really represents the order that you want to ideally place this information in as you're performing those close readings. Now you'll notice that if you look at these slides, not in full screen view, and instead in just kind of regular view, you'll see that I have additional explanations for each of these stages provided in the comment feature on the Google Slides. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. And so each section, you can click on it and it'll expand on that. And so I'll kind of talk about these briefly right now because I think that they're important to cover. So T being topic sentence that makes a claim. This is going to be ideally where a body paragraph begins, right? You want a topic sentence of some kind. And this should be one sentence and should be very clear in signposting for the reader where you are taking them in this paragraph. You want to remember that the claim is how you slice the larger pie / argument, so it should be related to your larger thesis. It will dictate the size of your pie slice or paragraph because it will indicate how much material you are covering. So the idea here is that the topic sentence is going to present an argumentative claim of some kind. Now this claim should relate to the larger thesis crust, because if we look back at the slide I just showed you, right? Each slice, of course, is still connected to the thesis crust and is still connected to the overall pie, which means that if we know the full pie is the argument, and the pie crust is the thesis, then each slice, which offers us a claim and a paragraph, should be related to that thesis that it's always connected to and should be part of that larger argument. It should not be off topic, okay? R is going to be review the critical detail or scene. And this is going to be the kind of part of your paragraph that should be 1 to 3 sentences maximum. And this is your what happened section. The review section of your paragraph slice should state for your reader where or how the critical details from the primary source that you are focusing on are located in the text. That is, you are continuing to point them in a direction by also showing where you are drawing material from in the text. For example, if you were writing about something like the use of color in a specific comic to convey emotion, you would first need to explain where the colors are visible/used. This helps to avoid assuming that the reader knows the text as well as you do or has read it at all. Keep in mind that the review section should not be the longest section of your paragraph. If it is, you're summarizing what happens in the text more than you're analyzing how the text works. And so when we think then about reviewing the critical detail or scene, what this means is that ideally in a body paragraph where you're close reading your primary source, right, you're making a slice in the sense that you're slicing something from the thesis that you're focusing on, and you're focusing in on a key detail from your primary source so that you don't overwhelm your paragraph with too much information or try to tackle too much beyond the scope of what's feasible to do in a paragraph. And with the review, what you're really doing here then is walking us through where did you see it, right? You're recapping for us the kind of where or what happened. From there, it's going to allow you to move to E, or examine closely the communication strategy. And this should be 2 to 3 sentences in a paragraph. And this is your how it works section. So based on what you just discussed as to where the strategy appears in the text, now you'll want to explore how it's used. Why did the creator opt for this strategy rather than a different one? For example, why this color choice and not another one? What is the creator trying to argue or show? Content. How do they use the strategy with the form to convey this content? And so this is going to be the point in your paragraph when you're analyzing that you really are going to expand on what is significant or happening here in terms of the how it works, right? So if previous to this, you're covering the kind of what happened or where it happened, this is going to be your opportunity for you to really delve into, what was the reasoning behind this self-representation choice or, kind of mediation choice that your creator went with? Why did they do this as opposed to something else? And how did this type of decision then inform kind of how effectively this argument is conveyed to the reader or the audience who is engaging with the text? The A here is going to be assess effectiveness of strategy. And this should be 2 to 3 sentences. And this is your evaluation section in a body paragraph. And then after you have stated where the strategy is located in the text, which is review, and explained how it works, examine, you will then need to indicate how well the content and form work together in the text. For example, if you're writing about the use of color in a comic, in this section of the paragraph, you'll need to analyze how effective the color is in conveying the author's argument to the reader. Did it work? Did it not work? Are there constraints? Are there ways that it could have worked better, right? This is where you're kind of really getting into to what extent does this work in doing what it's been utilized to do based on the author's project. And then finally, T, or transition to next topic. This should be 1 sentence, and this is your bridge section. Here you'll need to develop a point of connection between what you've discussed in this paragraph and what you intend to explore in the following paragraph. In your pie, the transitions are the tip of each slice at the center of the pie that connects all parts to each other. How does what you've analyzed in this paragraph help to prepare the reader for what you will analyze in the following paragraph? So again, that's going to really be this point right here, okay? Now, I want to be very clear in saying that me talking about writing is a treat is specifically thinking about essay writing in general that is kind of analytical in nature. I'm not saying that you need to take this approach for your literature review, but what I'm saying is that when you do your final project, this structure is going to be very useful to consult in terms of thinking about how you organize your ideas as they start to get bigger, and as you start to think about how you connect all these parts to each other, okay? And so I really encourage you to kind of keep writing as a treat in mind when you're thinking ahead to the final project. And I introduce it here because I want it to already be sort of in your back pocket as you're breaking on the literature review, mostly to emphasize that this is going to be the part of your final project where you're performing those primary source close readings. So when you are taking the opportunity to analyze something in your primary source or sources, using the tree approach is going to be a really beneficial way to organize those close reading paragraphs. So again, this goes to the point that when we talk about the full slice of a pie, right? If we know that the pie filling, which is this part right here, the full pie is your argument, right? The pie filling is really going to be those close readings of your primary source, focusing on things like color, use of personal narrative, use of a particular technique, any kind of strategy, right, that you're observing in your creator's text that you can then proceed to close read as part of your analysis of the primary source. And what this gets at is that the evidence close reading of your primary source in each paragraph fills the space created by the crest by fulfilling the promises of the thesis crest, right? So if you're telling your reader that you're going to be focusing on how personal narrative does something specific in the text, you should fill your pie filling up with actual examples of that personal narrative in the text and really walk us through how it's achieving what you say that it's achieving. Similarly, if you're analyzing the use of color in a particular comic, you tell us in the thesis that the use of this color is significant in conveying a specific theme, the pie filling then should really fill up the outline of this thesis by giving us, primary source close readings that actually accomplish showing us where this is happening and analyzing for us how it's happening and how effectively it's happening. And so again, the thesis crust supports the slice by forming the larger argument of the pie. It provides the foundation for the pie to take shape and convince the intended audience to accept the argument. So we can think then about evidence close reading as being your pie filling, right? Or once again, meaning that if we understand from the textbooks that our primary source acts as our evidence, then our primary source close reading is our evidence close reading, or the pie filling that we need to fill up this entire pie and to help really fill our argument. And so an evidence close reading is the pie filling, which comprises the majority of the pie and produces the flavor associated with that pie. It's the combination of some of your ingredients. The rest of those ingredients go to the thesis, and it builds upon the foundation of the pie crust to develop and bake properly. The size of the pie is determined by how much is needed to satisfy the appetite of the consumer or consumers. The number of pie slices or paragraphs could be mistaken as being arbitrary, when in actuality, it's determined by how many consumers there are and what slice size they each want at the time. So again, this goes back to our talks last week about audience and scope of your project. The pie filling must be mixed together well before being added to the crust. Otherwise, the consumer will take a bite and will immediately identify that it is incomplete or improperly combined. The pie filling needs enough ingredients to be combined well before pouring and enough time to bake. Failing to complete any or all of these steps will result in an ugly and or bad tasting pie. Okay, so the idea here is that you need to really combine and create this pie filling to a satisfactory degree before you are really pouring it into the pie crust that we created in the introductory section. Without doing so, right, if we pour in kind of poorly mixed together or underdeveloped pie filling, even if we have a really robust and solid pie crust, the pie isn't going to taste good because the pie crust is not being well filled by that pie filling, and the pie filling is not meshing well with the pie crust. I wanted to briefly offer a sample baking demo for a primary source close reading. So in this kind of scenario, I wanted to just kind of briefly talk through just some concrete examples of what I'm getting at with talking about imagining, you baking a pie filling in terms of your close reading. So let's say hypothetically, you wanted to use the one of the comics from Nes Garza as kind of your primary source for the final project. And let's say that you wanted to use this one in particular, where she's really talking about the question or that they are asked at many points of what will really change or materially happen if people stop shopping at Amazon, right? And so when we think about how you could approach using this comic as your primary source for the final, you could think about a couple of things, right? So here's what the layout of the comic looks like when you actually screenshot and assemble each of the panels in the carousel post next to each other as opposed to swiping, right? So we can see it kind of all laid out here. Some possible strategies that you could highlight from this text as, allowing you to use it as a primary source might be the use of speech bubbles or the storyfying element that is the speech bubbles, right? Perhaps you decide in your introductory section that you'd like to talk about the fact that the comic allows for there to be speech bubbles where the character is really kind of conveying to the reader specific sources of information that feel like a conversation as opposed to being talked at, right? And you can really kind of think here about the way that these speech bubbles populate every single one of the panels and kind of the significance of it being speech bubbles as opposed to narration boxes. What does that do differently than if we had narration boxes in each panel? You could also consider a critical detail like the geometrizing of the narrator, right? What do we see in terms of this narrator? What kinds of techniques are used here in terms of how this narrator is drawn? What are they wearing? What do they look like? How is their body positioned? How do they move throughout the frame, right? That could also be a critical detail that is utilized or highlighted in a primary source close reading. You could also consider the use of personal narrative as an example of one of the primary source close readings that could be completed here, right? The use of I statements, the combination of speech bubbles coupled with personal narrative in which the author is sharing their experiences of working at a warehouse and how that personal experience really shapes kind of their current stance on the issue. You could also really consider how personal narrative is being visualized in this text by way of the panel and the speech bubbles, and how the storyfying elements kind of create the opportunity to really hear from the author, even though the author, of course, is working in a two-dimensional capacity. You could also consider the combination of the Instagram caption or text-based writing with multi-panel comic or image-based carousel posts. So for example, in looking back to this slide, right, we not only have the comic itself, but we also have the caption posted beneath the post that expands on what Nes Garza is talking about in regards to Amazon, right? And so something you could consider is that if you decided to work with one of the comics for the final project, perhaps you talk about what is conveyed through the caption as one example of a primary source close reading, right? Where you analyze perhaps like what types of information is provided here? Are there hashtags being used? How are I statements or personal narratives also showing up here, right? And how does that compare or contrast with what is being conveyed through the comic itself, right? And this would really give you the opportunity to consider how does this comic being posted to Instagram perhaps change the way that it's being read by the reader as opposed to if it were printed in a newspaper or even printed in an anthology or in another capacity, right? So this is just one example that you can think of then. And if we were to envision kind of the pie that we could potentially create here, right, we could consider that the larger argument that this final project could make could be something along the lines of perhaps the state of fast fashion or the ways that Amazon has really radically changed how we access goods and services in the US, or even just our perspective of the mail system, right? There's many different ways that you could make an argument or talk about kind of the larger topic, or even you could base this final project around something to the effect of, how people who are currently or formerly warehouse workers are using the kind of web comic format as the way to share their experience, given that we know kind of this company to be really anti-union, right? And then from there, that would create the opportunity to develop a literature review around topics like, the rights of and conditions for warehouse workers in the United States. It could be something to the effect of the way that the mail system or even just our perceptions of quick delivery have evolved in the last 10, 15 years, right? Could be a literature review about kind of the evolving US economy, the way that internet shopping has really changed things, et cetera, et cetera. And then the primary source close readings would really be where you could then focus on this comic as being your evidence or, showing these concepts in action. So I'm going to talk about baking a literature review and really what you're going to need to kind of accomplish this assignment. So we've talked thus far about, recapping rhetoric from the textbooks that we've read in the last 2 weeks and really all semester. And we've also talked about some general ways that we can begin thinking about the larger process of creating the body of your paper or the close reading section that really populates the paper or kind of populates an analytical research project, right? Now, baking a literature review is going to be our focus for this week in terms of assignment. And we're going to really return to aspects of the close reading section of, thinking about argument as pi in week 7 and 8 when we prepare for the final project. And so for now, we can envision that even though we know that ultimately you are baking a full-size pumpkin pie with, secondary connection topping and close reading pie filling, et cetera, for this week, we know that what you're going to be baking is kind of like a mini pumpkin pie, in the sense that as opposed to creating a full-scale pumpkin pie, you're beginning to bake the pumpkin pie by doing kind of a little tester. And the literature review is really going to be an opportunity for you to do this tester because it's a standalone literature review, which means that you don't need to write a full essay with the literature review sandwiched within it, which is more consistent with what a final kind of looks like in this class. And I'll talk more about that next week. For now, you can kind of imagine that the literature review this week is really about you creating the small size version that will keep developing into a larger pie once you kind of get a hang of developing these like tester mini pies. So if you look at this particular slide outside of full view, you'll see that I also left you a comment here. And in it, I say the table as a whole, or kind of the table where the pie that you are baking for your final is placed, is the overall scholarly conversation that each baker is contributing to by producing their own intervention or argument point of view. The purpose of contributing a pie to the table is that the author is adding to what is on an existing table. That is an ongoing scholarly conversation, but are doing so in such a way that they're considering what is missing, what could be improved upon, what we need more of, etc., for the dinner to be as delicious as possible. And you'll notice that like in this section here, I talk about the midterm. This is something specific to when I teach this class in person and in the full session. But kind of the general ideas here are still useful to keep in mind, that particularly down here, when I say through the semester research project, you'll make the transition from observer and taste tester to baker as you prepare an argument pie of your own to eventually contribute to a table at the holiday gathering. That is the scholarly conversation. What I'm getting at here is that when we move to creating the semester research project, what you're really doing is moving from what you did on the response papers and the highlight reels, where you observed how somebody else made an argument and somebody else communicated a message, and instead you're actually doing it in your own right, okay? So what do I mean by that? When we analyze the literature review and close reading in your author's secondary source, right, it's about understanding how effectively the baker pours the pie filling or their close readings or primary sources into their pie crust. The thesis formed from the intro section based on how big of a pie or the scope that they're baking. So what I'm getting at here is in the literature review, what you're proceeding to do is you are analyzing and observing how another author has gone about the process of constructing their argument. And ultimately, the aim here is you're determining, will the way that they proceeded to analyze this argument, put together this argument, be of use to my own research project? So you can kind of think about it as you're almost doing like an anatomy of an argument here, where what you're effectively doing is, selecting and choosing secondary sources for this literature review that are contenders to be included in as supplemental support in your final project. And through the process of trying to decide what you will ultimately keep or use in your final project, you have to first actually analyze how did they put their own argument together, and did the way that they put this argument together ultimately produce, outcomes, observations, data, what have you, that will help me put together and support my own argument. And so when we think then about this process of baking an argument, right, the baker places this pie into an oven to bake. That is, gradually makes something new from the original ingredients and adds garnish or secondary source connections or a literature review to enhance the flavor, refinement, and appeal of the finished pie. So in a secondary source that you're using, right, or that you're analyzing, what you're really thinking about is how did the author of the article or chapter, whatever it is that I'm looking at, how did they themselves include a literature review of some kind that really supplements the way that they themselves arrived at their argument, right? So did your author present an argumentative claim that they then back up with references to other secondary sources that they consulted as a way to support the evidence of their primary source close readings or as a way to back up the argument that they're making, okay? A great example of this would be Diana Zulli is capitalizing on the Look article that we read. If you look back at that article, you'll see that her literature review, or the section where she's really consulting with what's already been said on the topic, is very easy to locate because it comes right after the introductory section of her paper. And so I encourage you, if you're feeling a little unsure about kind of how you can locate where secondary sources are popping up in a secondary source and how they really inform an author's argument, the Diana Zulli article is a great article to look at as an example of this. And so what I'm really getting at here is that what you're going to be doing with the literature review is noticing how the sources that you decide you might want to work with in your final project are put together. And you're going to observe, how did your selections in terms of these secondary sources, how do they offer literature reviews? How do they present some kind of close reading, if they do? How did they really combine this close reading process into these references to the secondary sources, right? How big of a scope is their project that they present in this article or chapter? How did they add garnish by way of, adding a literature review of some kind that shows how they themselves are also consulting secondary research, et cetera, et cetera. And this is really going to make more sense as I get into the specifics of actually producing a literature review. So let's start with the pre-work research that you have to do to even begin constructing a literature review. And this is based on Who Said's chapter 5, which we did not look at for this week, but I think has some great takeaways that I wanted to make sure that you had in hand, okay? So when we think about the process of pre-work, this is going to necessitate surfing the web, as they phrase it, or conducting frequent Google searches that we also want to keep in mind should not be equated with researching scholarly publications or sources in depth. So oftentimes our current research process is one in which we go to Google and we kind of look up, what topics or what keywords relate to the thing that I'm interested in, right? And so the authors are really clear in saying, we don't want to just assume that Googling a lot means that we actually have come up with sources that are going to yield what we need for our project. Instead, we need to take care of what sources we place our trust in, and this is going to take time to really vet that information in those sources. One of the reasons that we want to keep this in mind is that we want to consider how internet search algorithms and social media platforms are designed to show us more of what we want and our personal biases to keep our attention. And this should kind of help us think back to the attention economy that we read and engaged with by way of Diana Zulli. And the authors from the textbooks tell us that because the internet is rife with misinformation and algorithms that prey on our personal biases, it's easy to find articles that confirm what we believe or fear, regardless of whether that information is grounded in fact. This is called confirmation bias. And so we want to keep in mind that when we're starting this process of researching for the literature review, we don't want to just default to assuming that doing a bunch of internet searches is doing research in the most effective way. And we also want to make sure that we're just not assuming that every source that we come across is worthy of our trust and attention. So how do we do this? They offer us kind of some suggestions here, right? And one of them is really thinking about how we can use something like Google Scholar. Now, the Scholar function is something that whether you've used it or not, I think is actually more effective than kind of the general search engine. Reason being that on the Scholar version of the site, academics typically maintain a kind of profile. They have, kind of an updated list of things that they've published in recent years. And it's also often I have found one of the easier ways to find a source that I'm looking for. And then I can go back to the OSE website and kind of look for the information after I've identified what it is that I want to use, right? And so tip number one in terms of getting started with the pre-work for your lit review would be try using Google Scholar as opposed to the regular search engine. The second tip would be limiting the results to websites ending in .edu, .org, or .gov in terms of websites that you're consulting. And while this tip is helpful in the sense that it's going to make sure that you're really finding, kind of sources that are related to institutions, we also want to keep in mind that when doing popular culture research, it's very possible that you'll also need to consult articles for the popular press, like interviews, like magazine articles, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why you'll kind of see in the literature review prompt that you may find that you'll need one or two sources that are a bit more general to go along with what it is that you're talking about in terms of academic sources, just to make sure that you have that kind of robust coverage of the conversation that's being had on a topic. The authors also talk about Wikipedia. And one of the things that I really appreciate that they cover is that they say that if you scroll to the bottom of nearly any entry on Wikipedia, you will find a list of sources, and many of those lists include hyperlinks. And so while you wouldn't want to use Wikipedia as an exclusive resource in your own work, you can use Wikipedia to find other resources, many that would, after you examine them, be considered valuable and credible. And so what they're getting at here is that you do not want to cite Wikipedia as one of your secondary sources for the literature review. But what you can do is use Wikipedia as a starting point to just kind of get a sense for what are some of the things that people have said on this topic, or maybe some general information that you could use as keyword searches. And from there, you can also observe, are there secondary sources that are posted to the Wikipedia page that could be really beneficial to look into further and see if you can vet it and use it as a verified secondary source. I wanted to once again show this page about finding resources that I talked about earlier in this presentation, namely because I wanted to pair it with some kind of additional steps or tangible steps forward that you can think about when engaging with this pre-work step of writing the literature review. First of which is reviewing the prompt and KS feedback. So as I mentioned before, you obviously have the prompt for the literature review, and that's going to be a good starting place in terms of really starting to dive into this assignment. But more than that, you'll find that on your research proposal between Monday and Tuesday of this week, I will be providing feedback on your research proposal, as will your semester survival group members. And I strongly encourage you to consider how the feedback you receive from me and from your peers can help orient you in a direction to thinking about what it is that you can focus on for your final project and for this literature review. And so before you kind of really dive fully into the research for your literature review, I encourage you to look at the feedback from me and your peers, especially because the feedback that I'm going to provide is going to be about kind of providing you with some suggestions about some keywords that you might want to look into, and just some general ideas of what you might want to kind of start researching for this literature review that could ultimately be beneficial for your final project. I'm also super happy to provide feedback during office hours. And so if at any point you want to talk there and just kind of get into the specifics of your project, please feel free to do so. I'm also especially happy to talk about, potential secondary sources, or even kind of look them up with you during office hours if you find that researching is really tricky for you. So beyond reviewing the prompt and my feedback and your peers' feedback, you also would want to kind of consider, researching your topic and audience when selecting source types. And so you want to really keep in mind, what is the larger research topic that I'm focusing on with my project, even beyond the specific argument that I'm making. And that's going to be part of what's helping you cast a wide net. And you want to consider, who is the audience for your final project. Obviously, you have the audience of me and your peers for this final, but you want to think beyond that, right? Who would really be the audience for a project on this topic? Who would be interested in it? And how can knowing your audience help you in part to think about the types of resources that you want to be consulting and ultimately citing in your final project to sway your audience to find your argument compelling. And then finally, I like to think about this finding resources stage as having the steps of SOS. S being save it and summary as you go, O being organize later, and S being spend more time than assumed. And this really kind of gets at the document everything, collect now, sort later, and don't limit yourself suggestions that the authors make, right? So save it and summary as you go means make sure that you're holding on to everything that you come across during your literature review research stage. And in addition to saving it, summarize what stands out to you so you don't have to double back and do that later. The organize it later stage is really getting at the whole sense of figure out what you're ultimately actually going to use after the fact. Don't try to do too many steps concurrently, and it might get confusing. And spend more time than assumed means you actually want to devote a bit more time to this pre-work stage than you think you're going to need, because sometimes it actually takes an office hour appointment with me, or an email exchange with me, or more time on the Scholar site, or more time on the OSU OSU website to actually find what you need. And so really make sure that you're giving yourself enough time to do this pre-work. Don't try to tackle pre-work and writing the literature review the same day, especially not the day that it's due. This also gets into the point of, you'll want to choose your keywords carefully. And like I mentioned, I generally provide some suggestions for keyword searches on my research proposal feedback just to kind of help you get started with thinking about how you can start looking for things related to your topic. But I want you to kind of pause this lecture and read this page. Again, I'm trying to be as time savvy as possible with this already lengthy lecture, but please definitely pause the lecture and read this page because they provide some really good examples of thinking about how you can choose your keywords in such a way that you're going to kind of get the most, in essence, like most effective use out of search engines, and you're not just putting in words that aren't going to yield the results that you need. Same goes for Boolean searches. They really expand here on talking about the usefulness of connecting words. Again, pause to read. You'll want to take a look at Boolean searches as a way to really think about how you're maximizing the ways that you're using internet search engines when you are conducting research. I've also provided a quick link here to Google Scholar in case you're a person who likes quick links. So you can click the image and you will be redirected to the site. But the reason, like I said, that I really like the Scholar site as opposed to the general search engine is because I think that, you know, what Google Scholar does well is that it really organizes the information in a more readable capacity than we see with the general search engine. And additionally, as I mentioned, academics, many of them maintain profiles on this site. And so if you're looking up a particular author or looking for particular topics, you can oftentimes find information that's of scholarly source nature much easier here than you can in the general search engine, which is going to pull in anything that has, you know, words related to what it is that you're talking about. So for example, and this kind of goes to the keyword stuff. So I'll just say briefly. So let's say in knowing that you're talking about social media in some capacity with your final, let's say that you typed in social media to the Scholar search engine. You'll notice that it's going to provide results that are pretty general, right? Of what is social media update 2014, social media update 2016, predicting the future with social media, etc. And you'll see that there's some related searches provided here that kind of give you some insight into some other terms that people have used to search on this topic. But I want to direct you to a few things. One of which is you can really customize the range of what articles you're looking for based on the tab over here. And you can also just like kind of customize this range to think about, are you talking about a specific time period? Are you deciding that you want to talk about something that's unique to the 2010s? Are you talking about something specific to the 2020s, right? This might be something that's good to kind of mess with to change what, you know, search filters are enabled that will kind of transition which kinds of search results that you'll get. But generally speaking, we're going to find that a term that's kind of broad like this, like social media, is going to yield pretty broad results. Now, let's say you changed it to social media algorithms, and you'll notice that we already have different search results like negotiated autonomy, the role of social media algorithms in editorial decision-making, when algorithms shape collective action, social media and the dynamics of cloud protesting, social media, financial algorithms and the hack crash, algorithms ruin everything, hashtag RIP Twitter, folk theories and resistance to algorithmic change in social media. So you'll notice that compared to the previous slide, right, we already have way more specific search results here, but also we can notice that in terms of the publications that are being picked up by the algorithm or by the search engine, right, they also are ones that are more specific to cultural studies, social media studies, right? And so we also know that doing this might give us some ideas of other journals or publications to look at that might have search results in that particular issue, or might have, you know, entries in an anthology that also could be an even better fit than what's picked up by the engine here. Similarly, if we changed our, you know, keywords to social media oppression, we can once again see that the search results change, and we can really see kind of how the search engine is picking up on the terms that we're referencing. And as you'll kind of see with the previous slide that I asked you to pause and read about Boolean searches, you really want to think about kind of what words are you using in what order that can help to kind of key into the search engine to ideally get you results that are closest to your topic and your argument as possible. Something else that's really cool about Google Scholar is you'll see sometimes this sort of section pop up of user profiles. And I use the scholar Deborah Merskin as an example. So if you typed in her name to Scholar, you'll see user profiles for Deborah Merskin, and it'll show up here. And you'll also see that beyond that, there will kind of be her first initial and last name here, which means that things that she's written are popping up here. But there's also an active user profile for her, which means that if you wanted to, you could click on her name and you'll be redirected to seeing all of the things that she's published, that she's entered into this scholar profile. Now, one of the reasons that this can be very beneficial is you might find in the course of your research that a particular name keeps coming up and you're like, okay, they talk generally about social media or pop culture and they might be good to look into, right? And so one way to do that might be looking on Scholar and seeing if they have an active profile. Additionally, you might find that something that comes up for this person when you used a different keyword search combination yielded some close-ish results, but not exactly what you wanted. And it's possible that by looking at the scholar themselves, they might have something that's a bit better suited to your project. You can also see how often that they're cited. And this can be a helpful tool as well for vetting. Is this a credible source that I really want to stick with or kind of reference in some capacity in my final? Additionally, the other thing that's useful about Scholar is that when you go to a scholar's profile, you can also change the kind of order that their work is displayed in based on how many people have cited it and the year it was published in. So looking at Trevor Buffoni's Scholar profile, we can see that if we changed year, right, it would then change the order of what's displayed to us in terms of what he's recently published. And so, for example, Trevor Buffoni might be someone that you're interested in citing because he publishes quite regularly on TikTok. Or you might find that some of the other people he publishes with, you want to look into their work and see if they've written something that's a bit closer in relevance to your topic than perhaps what Trevor has written about. The other place, of course, that is super useful to use for your research purposes is the OSU library site. And oftentimes, of course, we are encouraged to kind of use this search bar here as our primary way of using the website and just kind of familiarizing ourselves with what the library has. But I also encourage you to use the My Account feature, specifically because doing that's going to allow you to access your ILLiad account. And if you have not used this account service, it's really helpful for requesting items that are not currently available through OSU's library system. This might mean it could be a digital copy of something, a scan of a book chapter, etc. This feature is really helpful, especially if you're not in Columbus this summer. Using your ILLiad account can be a way to access something that maybe you found on Scholar. It isn't accessible. You couldn't find it on the OSU website, and you can instead request that you get access to it through your institutional affiliation. So how it works is the site has kind of changed, I think, since I created this screenshot. But generally how it works is there will be a tab that says make a request, and you can request an article, a book chapter, et cetera, et cetera. Typically article or book chapter is going to be most often what I find students need, maybe a loan of a book, but generally I see that it's an article or a book chapter. And I have some examples here that you can even see of what a request looks like once you've made it through the system. But basically, once you indicate if you want an article or a book chapter, you'll fill out this form, you'll fill it in with the information that you need, and then there's usually a pretty quick response time, and then you can gain access to an article or a book chapter that you need for your project, especially if you were not able to gain access to it online. I have found that generally speaking, being logged into your OSU email, even if you're looking on the Scholar site and other sites, is another good way to figure out if you have access to something online. But if you run into any trouble with these things, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to help you learn how to navigate the OSU library site and just figure out how to gain access to text that you might need. But in general, with this pre-work stage of your literature review, there are some guiding questions that you can keep in mind. What do you know about the author? Is the source backed by a reputable publisher? Has the source been peer reviewed? Is the source current? Does it need to be? Does the source provide bibliographical data, right? Does it have a works cited page? Has the source been cited by other writers? And is the argument reasonable? These are some guiding questions that are super helpful to keep in mind if you're really struggling with this issue of like, does the source that I'm thinking of using perhaps fit what I need for this literature review? Additionally, I offer kind of these steps for evaluating the legitimacy of a source based on kind of what the textbooks tell us. And we can think about this as being the acronym of CARS: credibility, accuracy, reasonableness, and support. So credibility is going to be that it's a trustworthy source. The author can be identified, they can be contacted, known or respected authority, author's credentials, evidence of quality control, and organizational support. That's going to really constitute credibility of an author and a source. Accuracy is going to relate to that it's a current text, that there's a date of update/revision provided, that it's factual, detailed, exact, comprehensive, the audience and purpose reflect intentions of completeness and accuracy, and it gives the whole truth. Reasonableness is going to relate to fair, balanced, objective, reasoned, no conflict of interest, absence of fallacies or slanted tone, is the information likely, possible, or probable. And finally, support is going to relate to listed sources, contact information, available corroboration, claims supported, and documentation supplied. A source that you can triangulate, find at least 2 other sources that support it. This is a general checklist that you can use, this CARS checklist, that can help you as you're doing this independent pre-work of trying to locate secondary sources that might be a good fit for your final project and that you can really go through the evaluation process of through your literature review. I'm going to pause here before talking about the DISCA method, and then we will cover what this is comprised of. All right, let's talk DISCA. So thus far in this section, we talked about the pre-work that you'll need to do, or the pre-work research that you'll need to do in order to find the secondary sources you're going to need for your literature review. Now we're going to transition into how do you actually write the literature review. And this can be broken down into the DISCA method that you structure your literature review around. So eventually the literature review that you produce for this assignment will be reworked into secondary connections that are integrated into your final project. To preview what this may look like in your project, you want to review scholarly sources we've read this semester for examples of how they provide a literature review in the course of their analysis. And as I mentioned, the Diana Zulli Capitalizing on the Look article is a great example of this, and I will pull that next week to talk about that, to give some examples of what a final project can look like. But for now, when we think about the literature review, the good news is that like the research proposal, the literature review can feature tentative language, such as I might or I anticipate, rather than concrete language about how the secondary sources you located will inform the organization and focus of the final project. So the literature review is kind of like an elaboration on the research proposal, but the difference here is that you're starting to think about what support in terms of kind of additional lenses could you use to really build out the robust and nuanced nature of the argument that you're preparing to provide by way of your final project. So producing the literature review really is a 2-part process. The pre-work, or gathering your secondary source ingredients during the research stage, is followed by the writing, or forming connections to secondary research. This is accomplished by using a cookie cutter on excess dough that is left over from your thesis pie crust to create enhanced support for specific areas of interest in your argument. Where you place the secondary connection garnish will be determined in part by what areas of the close reading pie filling you think would benefit from the additional support. So what I'm getting at here is that the purpose of a secondary connection, like the ones that you'll provide in your final project, are to enhance what you've already done with your primary source close readings. If our pie was solely made of the thesis pie crust and the secondary connection pie decorations, we wouldn't have much to eat, right? So the idea is that the pie filling, or the primary source close readings, really comprise the majority of what you are offering to the reader of your project. And these secondary connections in terms of these decorations are enhancing or adding to the strength of those primary source close readings. And so our task with your literature review this week is to think about, do I have secondary sources that could potentially be in great enough shape, right, kind of formed well, that they would work in a very kind of useful capacity to even do that enhancement work that I'm looking for. So what I've done is I've provided a how to bake literature review connections from thesis pie crust recipe card. And this is posted to Carmen. It's posted next to the literature review prompt in this week's module. And what I've done is provide a how-to that takes you step by step through how to write your literature review. And this is also partially why kind of the sections that precede this one in this lecture, we're all about really introducing the concept of writing the body of an argumentative paper. Whereas for our purposes, we're thinking about producing a literature review that's kind of like, a rough tentative idea that will eventually develop into supplying some of those close reading enhancements that we've been talking about. And we'll get into this more next week. But for now, I want you to really think about following this recipe card as closely as you can once you've located and identified what secondary sources you'd like to use in your literature review. And so your literature review, and this really rehashes what's covered in the prompt, is comprised of a few things. Your literature review for this paper or for this assignment should have an introductory section, and it should be comprised of the following. It should have 2 to 3 sentence research topic overview, and this can be copied and pasted from your research proposal. So as I'm looking at your research proposal draft, if there's a 2 to 3 sentence section where you do a great job of really establishing what your research topic is, I will most likely label this and say, copy and paste and put this in the literature review. But this is generally going to need to be where you give us that point of entry into your topic, okay? You'll also need a 1 to 3 sentence transition to your project's argumentative intervention. This is going to be things like concept definitions, so what, purpose, etc. And so the transition means you're going to move from kind of the broader idea of your paper, right? Those 2 to 3 sentences that broadly introduce us to what research topic you're covering. You'll need to then move to a transition that really establishes what you are arguing in the course of this paper, right? So what is your topic? But what are you arguing in particular about this topic? From there, you'll want to provide a 1 to 2 sentence revision of thesis statement that makes clear potential primary source or sources, tentative methodology, and contribution to the scholarly and popular discourse on the research topic. So what I mean by this is you will have provided a thesis statement rough draft in your research proposal. And so in the intro section for your literature review, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to provide a revision of that thesis statement based on the feedback that you've received from me and your peers. And this thesis statement should really establish for us what primary source or sources are you thinking of using for your final project? What's your methodology or how-to? How are you planning to, actually, conduct this argument for your final? And what contribution are you making to the conversation based on the project that you're putting together? And then finally, your introductory section should feature a 2 to 4 sentence context/explanation for the types of secondary sources covered in this literature review, specifically how they relate to your initial research questions and how they represent aspects of your topic's scholarly and popular discourse. So what this context/explanation really does is open up for us, okay, in the sections or paragraphs that follow, here are the types of secondary sources that I've consulted, right? Here's how I really envision them as being related to the argument that I want to ultimately put together in my final project. And here's how these secondary sources perhaps are the outcome of or are in conversation with the research questions that I posed in my research proposal. Okay, so it's setting us up for knowing what it is that we're about to read in the kind of body of your literature review. Now, the body section of your literature review is going to be where you follow the DISCA method, okay? And you'll need to produce a DISCA synthesis for each secondary source that you reference. And so DISCA can really be broken down into describe, summarize, connect, and anticipate. And so this is going to mean that for each part or each paragraph that you produce related to a secondary source, you should have clearly identified and responded to the DISCA elements related to this source. So, for example, you'll need to start with describe. Discuss the publication context, author credentials, and publisher credibility for each secondary source referenced. So if you think about treat, just as a kind of general example, the describe section of the paragraph is kind of like your topic sentence, right? This is going to be where at the beginning of the paragraph, you discuss where is the article or chapter from, who wrote it, what are the credibility metrics that were used to assess its relevance to and usefulness to your project. And that's where kind of the CARS acronym from earlier and kind of the evaluation suggestions from earlier come into play. Following this describe section, you'll want to offer a summarize section. Here's where you're going to provide a comprehensive summary of the main argument, methodology, point of entry in the introductory section, literature review, and primary source close readings for each secondary source. For instance, don't simply say that an article is about personal confidence. What does the author or authors claim about personal confidence, and how do they support this claim? Demonstrate that you understand the central argument or message of each source and what materials the author or authors use to perform their analysis. So what I'm getting at here is following the describe section of like the what it is and how do I know that it's credible. The summarize section is going to be where you really focus in on, in essence, like what is covered by the secondary source and how is it put together? How did the author or authors produce an argument? The methodology, once again, is going to be their how-to. How did they conduct their argument? So I want you to really think back to the response papers that we've done, right? Thinking about things like, how did they arrive at the data that they did? How did they support their claim? How did they provide key concepts, right? The how-to. And then you'll really recap for us, how did they start the article or chapter? What did they begin with? What kind of a literature review did they offer? Did they offer multiple pages where they recap other authors' contributions on the topic to the scholarly conversation? Did they offer any kind of primary source close readings where they analyze something like, color or personal narrative or erasure or some kind of other key concept, right? So summarize is really where you get to the how is this source put together, okay? I have found that many students like to do their DISCA synthesis in sort of 2 steps. So for example, they like to put the describe and the summarize together in one paragraph because the summarize is pretty lengthy, and that is totally fine. And so I also kind of represent that here with this slide, that you may find that it's easiest for each source to have 2 paragraphs per secondary source, with 1 paragraph offering the describe and summarize, and then the other paragraph offering the connect and anticipate. So the describe and summarize, if we think back to our conversations about treat, right? They're really fulfilling the roles of T and R, right? As well as E, that they're kind of getting into the just to kind of backtrack to show you what I mean. Let's see. All right, so remembering kind of these details, right? In essence, the describe section of your DISCA method is really doing the topic sentence that makes a claim and is kind of establishing for us, this is what it is that I'm looking at, right? This is the secondary source that I've pulled. The summarize section is really where you're talking about the review the critical detail or scene and examine closely the communication strategy. You're kind of using similar tools here in the sense that you're really covering what is in the article, how is it put together, and how does the author offer an argument? What do they do to make their argument, okay? Now, what this is followed then by, with the remaining parts of DISCA, is connect and anticipate. And this is slightly different than kind of the ending of treat, okay? Connect and anticipate is specifically related to your final project. So D and S are really contained to what the author or authors did, whereas C and A are about what you want to do with the argument that they present. So connect is going to be about articulating how you see the secondary source connecting to either your primary source or sources, or the broader research topic related to your primary source. You want to explain this connection thoroughly to your reader and be as specific as possible. How is the source relevant to the primary source or sources that you're using in your final and that you're using to show concepts in action, right? How is this relevant? Why would this secondary source be in your lit review? How does it connect? Does it relate to the larger context? Does it help to explain a concept? Is there an example that they offer that you also want to focus on, right? How does this connect to your project and the primary source or sources that you're thinking of analyzing in your project? And finally, anticipate is all about explain how the source relates to your argument and predict how you could use this secondary source in your final project. How would citing the source enhance, complicate, support, vet, or contextualize your argument? Explain why you feel it would be productive to use the source in this way. So if we know that connect is about demonstrating the relevance, right? Here's how I see my project being in conversation with this project. Anticipate is about sketching out how you think you could use this or consult the source in some way in your final. Okay, and this is where this is kind of mirrored to the research proposal, right? You're really delving into the specifics of here's how I anticipate that this secondary source could be of benefit to my project. Now, as a note, if you find that after completing the describe and summarize part of DISCA, for your secondary source, that you're starting to see that there's not a huge connection and you're starting to anticipate that it won't actually be a good fit in your final, that is totally okay. You can definitely use the connect section to talk about, here's where I initially saw points of connection or relevancy between my project and this project. And then you could use the anticipate section to talk about, I initially anticipated that I might do this with this, but after completing my DISCA synthesis, it's turning out that it actually would not be well suited for my project at all. And that is not a loss. It's not like you're going to get less credit for your discus synthesis by talking about the fact that you've discovered that the source isn't a good fit after all. If anything, you're demonstrating that you're really doing that close thinking by realizing that your opinions on the text simply had to change based on the needs of your project. And then finally, you have the concluding section. And this should offer a 2 to 3 sentence review of overall insight gained on the research topic and on the scholarly and popular discourse from researching secondary sources for the literature review. What did you learn? What did you find? How did your perhaps opinion change on your topic? What has maybe evolved in terms of your thoughts about your argument, right? What are the takeaways? You'll follow this then with a 2 to 3 sentence recap of credibility and relevance of selected secondary sources. And here's where you're going to want to think about author credentials and how the source relates to the project. And finally, a 3 to 5 sentence discussion of where specifically you anticipate integrating these secondary sources into the final project. For example, the introductory section, a context paragraph in a lit review section to support a close reading of a primary source, etc. All right, so to recap, your literature review is going to have 3 sections: an introductory section, a body section, and a concluding section. The introductory section is going to be your big picture stuff, right? Give us a 2 to 3 sentence research topic overview that can be pulled from the research proposal. I'm also going to need a 1 to 3 sentence transition to your project's argumentative intervention. So move from talking about the topic to getting into what it is that you're thinking of arguing. This can also come from the research proposal. You'll need a 1 to 2 sentence revision of the thesis statement based on the feedback you get from me and your peers on your research proposal. And you'll need a 2 to 4 sentence context / explanation that sets us up for understanding what it is that you're going to cover in the body of your literature review on this assignment. For each secondary source that you perform or that you discuss in your literature review, there should be a discus synthesis. And it can either be 1 paragraph per source or 2 paragraphs, maybe more than 2. Like I said, generally I find students like to break this into 2 paragraphs per source so that they can do DNS in 1 paragraph and CNA in another. For every secondary source in your literature review, you should describe, where you discuss the publication context, author credentials, and publisher credibility for each secondary source referenced. The sections that precede this one in this lecture will help you really delve into credentials and credibility, and I'm also happy to talk about this as well. Following describe, you should summarize, where you provide a comprehensive summary of the main argument, methodology, point of entry in the introductory section, literature review, and primary source close readings for each secondary source. This is where you tell me what's in the source, how is it put together? How does the argument come together for the creator? This is the content and form of your secondary source. What is being argued? How is it being argued? How is the source put together? Following describe and summarize, you're going to need to connect and anticipate for every secondary source. With connect, you're articulating how you see the secondary source connecting to either your primary source or sources or the broader research topic related to your primary source. And then you anticipate by explaining how this source relates to your argument and predict how you could use the secondary source in your final project. The connect and anticipate are all about where's the relevancy between this project that you've talked about and your project that you're developing, and how do you anticipate using this project in some way in your final. And finally, the concluding section for your paper or this assignment should feature a 2 to 3 sentence review of the overall insight that you gained after completing this literature review. There should be a 2 to 3 sentence recap of credibility and relevance, in which you're really kind of recapping for me how you know that the secondary sources that you're choosing to move forward with are credible to consult. And finally, a 3 to 5 sentence discussion where you specifically anticipate integrating these secondary sources into the final project. Where would you place them? Where would they go? Where would they be most useful to you? And this kind of provides an overall map, if you will, of what it is that you're ultimately doing with this literature review, right? You're researching secondary sources on databases, you're skimming a variety of secondary sources, you're committing to 4 to 6 secondary sources with at least 2 being scholarly and the remainder being from the popular press, or they could be more scholarly sources. You're deep reading the secondary sources that you commit to. You're taking detailed notes as you deep read on the text argument and evidence and how it's put together. You're taking detailed notes as you deep read on how this text connects in some way to your primary source. So in some respects, this box represents what it is that you're getting at with the summarize section, and this box gets at what you're getting at with the connect section. You'll write an entry for each secondary source in MLA style, and this will go on the works cited page. You'll develop an outline of the secondary source for reference, and with these outlines, you'll produce a discus synthesis of each secondary source for the literature review body. So we are close to the end here. How to synthesize a source or avoiding plagiarism. All right. Because I'm trying to be mindful of time, I'm not going to go into these things exhaustively. However, I will be looking for summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting in your literature review. And much of the feedback that I provide on your literature review rough draft will be focused on giving you some suggestions on how to make sure that you are understanding the differences between summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting, and not accidentally plagiarizing your secondary sources. So this overview right here, I would like you to pause to read. This is going to explain the difference between these three techniques. And I would like for you to pause to read each of the slides that are featured in this section, because they're going to explain how you can avoid committing plagiarism on accident. Because as I've said before, it is a common issue that comes up in 1110 and 2367 as students are taking something that they're reading from an author and they're trying to synthesize it in their own words. The reason that I also provided these slides here is that I want you to really pay attention to how the books are explaining the process of summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting, and really consult these materials as a companion to you as you're proceeding to do the summarize section of your DISCA synthesis for each source, okay? And again, like I said, I don't have the time to cover these in exhaustive detail as much as I would like to, but I provide them here because I would like you to pause to read and also kind of use these as a way to build on what you've already gained from Who Says and So What. And so it will be important that we really talk about these. I generally like to talk about these most substantially in week 7. And so you'll see these same slides come back up next week, but I wanted to include them here just as kind of like a looking ahead, but also because I wanted to make sure that you have access to these pages while working on your literature review, since I will be talking about this in most substantial detail in week 7 to help you as you actually start to take what you've worked on with the research proposal and the literature review and start to change it into your final project rough draft. All right. Sort of last thing in this section is what's in a text, the works cited page. I have provided a short little video for you that gives a visual walkthrough on how to write in-text citations. I really encourage you to watch this video. It's only a few minutes long. I include it in part because it breaks up hearing my voice, but I also include it because I think it does a fantastic job of explaining how to cite a secondary source that will then be really important to come back to when it comes to the point of creating the rough draft of your final project, which we will talk about next week. Oops. All right. But when it comes to writing a citation or presenting an entry in the works cited page that you'll need to create for your literature review, you'll want to note a few things. So the citations comprise the works cited page, which is meant to tell your reader who wrote the text, what it's called, and when/where it was published, so that other people conducting research on these topics can locate these sources if desired, and your reader can see the work that you did to arrive at the conclusions that you did in your project. For each citation, you will need to use MLA format 8th edition. 9th edition is also fine, but 8th edition is more widely used, and the citation should be organized in alphabetical order. You'll want to make sure to write a citation for each secondary source that you include in your literature review. A helpful hint that I offer here is that you'll want to write a citation for each source as you find it. This will save you time rather than having to double back to write this information. Now, again, to save on time, but also because this is how I've generally found it the easiest way to do it, I've provided a comprehensive guide on how to cite your sources in MLA format via this hyperlink from Purdue OWL. And I've also created provided a comprehensive guide on how to cite your social media sources in MLA format from Columbia College. And so I ask that when you are putting together the works cited page for your literature review, you consult these two sources for examples and closely follow those examples. I am more than happy to look at drafts of your works cited page of the literature review, but I will also take a look at it when I review your literature review rough drafts when I'm providing you feedback before you turn in the final. All right, we've made it. So final thoughts, final things. I have provided some sample literature reviews so that you have examples for this assignment. I have generally found that the literature review is the most challenging assignment that students complete in this class. And so it's important to me that I have examples for you to reference. And I just wanted to kind of briefly mention that I have 5 examples for you. You'll notice a couple titles probably are going to look familiar because I've chosen to include some projects. I've chosen to include the research proposal, the literature review, and the final project for them, so you can see how the project developed over time. I also wanted to mention that I do have a Google folder with each of these literature reviews featured within it. You may come across the challenge that you may need to download these literature reviews and to be able to access them. Sometimes this is the case if it's not a Google Doc. I did post some of these as PDFs instead of Word documents because when I tried to convert them to Google Doc, it messed up the formatting, and I wanted to make sure that you had access to a sample that had the right formatting. I do also strongly encourage that in terms of examples, the literature review for The Ideal Mother and the literature review for The Criminalization of Tattoos Continues in the Classroom, those were the 2 top scoring literature reviews from this class. And so in terms of lit reviews that I think do sort of the most effective job of following a discus synthesis and offering the intro and concluding sections that you need, I really encourage to consult these 2 examples first. Though the Plastic Face of Instagram, How Social Media Affects the Mental Health of the Youth, and Anonymity, Comments, DMs on Social Media and Their Effects on Racism are also very strong. Just the first 2 are the strongest of the bunch that I received that semester. I also tend to offer examples from like a more recent iteration of classes that I teach, just because I find that, like, I don't know, the topics and also just like the structure tend to be more helpful, I found, for students than if I offer one from like years ago. So hopefully that's okay. And then finally, I have some sample final projects that can help you to look ahead to week 7 and 8. I have 8 samples that I've uploaded to a shared Google folder for you. And the link to that overall folder can be found here. And you'll find that I have indicated kind of what the form is for each of these projects. And my goal in doing that is to give you some ideas of some of the different creative options that students decided to go with for the final. And my hope is that also in seeing these projects, you can see a range of approaches that students took, and you can also see a range of approaches to utilizing their literature review findings in the final project that they developed. The only one that I have a kind of caveat for is that with Kylie Jenner's influence on body image, that student did a PowerPoint and a Zoom talk through, but I don't have the Zoom file in my records like I thought I did. So just know that this PowerPoint is a little incomplete in some places, but that's because the student actually talked through their findings alongside having the PowerPoint. If you would like to see, though, an example of a PowerPoint and Zoom talk through, you should be able to see that with the Ideal Mother project. But there are also some podcast episodes as well that you can consult just for some examples of kind of how audio is incorporated into these projects. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for sticking around for this entire lecture. If you made it, hopefully you watched it in little bits and pieces to break it up. I appreciate you all so much. I hope that you're doing okay, that you're feeling well, and that you have time for rest and relaxation in the midst of this busy summer. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you've got any questions, concerns, hopes, dreams, etc. And I will talk to you again soon. Bye, everybody.